Hello and welcome to Oxwich. Now my name's Dawn Thomas from Nature Days and I'm going to be taking you on your Oxwich field trip to undertake your A-level coursework, your NEA. The purpose of this video is to get you to start thinking about the sort of questions you might want to put into your inquiry, and also to introduce you to the site and get you to think about the concepts, the processes or the policies that might have been influencing this location and might be appropriate to do an inquiry about. There's some tasks that I've put into the video. You can undertake them if you like. There's also some supportive material which I've sent to your teacher that you can use to do some secondary research to find out any information you can online to help you with the literary review which you need to do before you undertake your investigation. If you have any questions, you can email them straight to me and then I can try and answer them either when you come out for your field trip or through an email. So my email is naturedays@reynoldston.com. This is Oxwich Beach, which has Oxwich National Nature Reserve beyond it. Now this is the location that you are going to be undertaking your NEA, your non-examined assessment for your Geography A-level. Now before you come on site and I introduce you to it in more detail, it's worth thinking about what kind of things you could investigate in your inquiry question. Consider the geographical processes that might be taking place at this location. What kind of concepts could you actually be investigating at this location? Is there any policies that might be associated with this location that you could investigate, or any local issues? And lastly, what about the perception of this location to people who are here or people who might be visiting? The kind of processes you might be thinking about are ones from the physical or natural side. So we can think about here might have longshore drift taking place. Other processes might be erosional processes. You can see there's a landslide here. Is this being created by erosion? Is this being made even worse by issues such as global climate change? We could also think about the human side. Is there any human issues here? This is a honeypot site with over 250,000 visitors every year, and you can see that the cars are right on the beachside here. Is there any processes which are linked to this location through the human interaction? The interactions of a negative kind, such as litter, erosion, the destruction of the embryo dunes, or it could be of a positive kind in terms of improving well-being and access to open space. In terms of concepts, is there any theories or models we can use to see if Oxwich actually conforms to the models? We've got a sand dune system here, so we've got a samosphere. So do we have a classic sand dune system? Do we have a destructive or a constructive landforms created in this location? Other concepts might be a bit harder to actually assess, but we could also link them, such as the influence of dredging on the Helwick bank, there by those boats which are removing sand. Other concepts, such as mitigating risk. How is Oxwich mitigating risk against the impact of humans on this coastal landform? Also, in terms of sustainability, how is Natural Resources Wales going to maintain a sustainable landscape here when in fact it's in dynamic equilibrium and changing all the time? When you've got pressure from the natural forces and processes creating or trying to create a climatic climax, and you've got the impact of humans coming in and eroding the front of the dunes, how do you maintain a balance so that you maximise the biodiversity but also allow for people to enjoy and access the sand dune system? You may want to look at the interaction between the human and the physical aspects of the reserve, looking at the positive side. For example, the management of the reserve. So we've got things like fences up here, which are to keep horses at one side of the reserve and not on the other. We could evaluate how effective and sustainable these management practices are to increase the biodiversity within the area. Picking your location, therefore, is going to be vital to make sure that your inquiry question can be answered. At the far end of the reserve, quite a long way from the car park, an awful lot of management has been taking place. Instead of allowing the dunes to overgrow and turn into trees, they have been chopped down and the trees have been removed. You can see the evidence of this. Now, this might be a good location to look at the impact of that management here compared to a location where it hasn't taken place. You've also got slacks far away from the car park, which have been turned into what we call controlled disaster zones. So in 2000 and 2001, this area was so overgrown that there wasn't any slack species, they were all woodland species. The trees were removed, but also the layer of organic matter which has been built up over many, many years was removed, and it was dug back down to the water table. So this has been left to recolonise since the year 2000, and it should have some good pioneer species. There are some other slacks on the reserve closer to the car park that haven't had this process or have undergone the same controlled disaster methods, but only 5 years ago. And this means you could compare the impact of management at different stages after the management has taken place. Other concepts we can look at are things like sphere of influence. How far have these cars and these visitors come to visit Oxwich today? We can look at their number plates, we could look at signs inside their cars, or we could ask them individually how far were they willing to travel. The sphere of influence then can be measured. We could also look at how far people are willing to travel within our landscape. So are people willing to travel a longer distance if they can't access car parking spaces to sit on the beach further away from the car park? Or are they limiting their use of the site based on their distance from the car park? We could investigate the concept of causality. Down here close to the car park, you can see there's heavy amounts of erosion. You've also got a distinct lack of embryo dunes. Further along, where you get less people sitting on the back of the beach, will you have a greater number of pioneer species and embryo dunes? If so, we could say that the cause of that is the reduced impact of visitors. We could look at management plans, such as shore management plans here. Is there a shore management plan for Oxwich? And if so, how is it working? Is it effective? And what plans are there in terms of reducing the impact and controlling the landforms here, and also trying to mitigate the impact of global climate change on the landscape? Are there planning policies or environmental control along here to try and protect the landscape from too much development? Oxwich Nature Reserve starts at the sand dunes behind the beach and goes on all the way to the other end of the beach, up to Nicholaston Woods in the background there. Now, because it is a nature reserve owned by NRW, there will be some environmental controls, but how are they maintained? Are they effective? Are they sustainable? And is there any conflict between the use of the reserve by dog walkers and by members of the public and the management for conservation? One of the biggest issues at Oxwich Nature Reserve is the fact that it's so accessible to the public and it is so popular with local people and the tourists, especially in the summer months. And the impact of such large numbers on a fragile environment will always be greatest where you have a higher proportion of visitors. So we've got issues with having fires, bonfires in the dunes, dog waters leaving their mess. With the closure of the toilets during the corona outbreak, there's going to be an increase in the amount of littering, especially of human feces. The area of worst impact is not where you would think, which is directly behind the car park, but is in fact behind this wooded area. This wooded area is a slack, and the management team have decided that to actually reduce the impact on the rest of the reserve, they actually let the trees grow here, even though it's not best for the conservation of the area, because they always get destroyed and used for firewood. Because behind here, behind this copse of trees, is where you find the most people having barbecues and making the biggest mess. So this area here has been left to overgrow because it's close enough to the car park so that people who don't care about the environment but have come to have fun and make a mess will not have to go very far, while they can leave their mess here, and the rest of the reserve would hopefully be preserved by them not going any further. It also provides them with a source of fuel so they don't pull up fence posts or damage any of the other furniture or structures within the park, which are here for management purposes. So you could investigate issues like this, conflicts between visitors and the local population, between the owners and NRW who are trying to conserve and people who are trying to visit. How do you limit the impact on the area, but then also allow visitors to enjoy the site? The last thing you could investigate is perceptions, people's perception of what Oxwich is like before they visit, or reasons for visiting it, perceptions of locals compared to visitors. Things like this provide a good starting point as to why people have come here, but also what people's perception is of the impact of their visits on the site. When you're choosing the specific area of geography you want to investigate, it's really important that you have an interest in that. So this location highlights a lot of concepts, processes, policies and issues that you could investigate. But think about one that you're interested in and you would like to actually know the answer to. So my first activity for you to think about is to either look back on the footage you've seen here or look at the photos that I provided in the story maps and see if you can identify what concepts, processes, policies, issues and perceptions you could identify and investigate at Oxwich. Once you've listed all of those, highlight or circle the ones that you have an interest in. We need to think about feasibility as well, so think about what you might be able to investigate in the time that you have. But just start thinking about what you are interested in and identify where that links into the Oxwich Nature Reserve. Once you've identified the geographical context for your investigation or your inquiry question, you need to think more detail about the location. Now, depending on what your inquiry is about, your location may be different within the Oxwich Reserve or on the beach. So if you're looking at interactions between the human and the physical, you will need to situate yourself close to where the humans are, so the visitors either close to the car park or close to the beach. If, however, you only want to look at the physical side, we want to make sure that those human impacts are not going to influence your data. So we need to get away from the car park and away from those visitors so that we can get some data that provides you with adequate and reliable data that you are looking to investigate. It's important to identify a specific location for your inquiry and also inclusion in your question. So Oxwich is a very big place. Consider the geographical area, then the location, and then the data point. So where are you actually going to collect your data? If you're looking at spatial distribution of your data, such as looking at the several stages of the sand dune system, then of course you need to do a transect from the sea all the way back to the back of the dunes to the woodland. However, this transect could be located in any of a million places next to the car park or all the way down to the far end of the reserve. So consider how you're going to locate your transect, why you're going to locate it, and make sure you can justify that. For your next task, if you look at the map of Oxwich, have a look at the concepts or processes that you've identified in task 1 that you might want to include in your inquiry. Try and allocate a suitable location for the undertaking of the data collection for those processes or concepts, and try and justify why that location is suitable. Why do you want to locate your transect or your data collecting near to the car park if you're looking at the impact of humans? Why do you want to allocate a transect far away from the car park when you're looking at the impact of wind speed? Thinking about directional features, especially in terms of microclimate and how they may impact your results in a way that you're not actually trying to investigate. You want to mitigate those measures that are actually going to impact your data, but you're not investigating by trying to make them as controlled as possible. Of course, being outside, we can't control all the variables, but if we choose our location carefully, we can make sure we limit them and we make our results as reliable as possible. Next, you need to consider what type of inquiry that you are going to give to your framework so you know how to plan your data collecting. There are 5 different types of inquiry, and each of them will relate to a different type of data collection technique and a different form of analysis. The first type is a descriptive inquiry, which is focused on identifying what is happening through a description or looking at the characteristics of the behaviour of something or a population. Now, this tends to rely heavily on qualitative data, so you need to consider that and how to make sure that that is reliable and unbiased. The next type is a comparative. So you could compare this location to another location, or this location to a process or to a theory that you've seen modelled in a book. You could also do comparisons over time. If you're considering a comparative inquiry, you must make sure you have the correct secondary data in order to compare it to, or if you're going to get hold of secondary data, look at that ahead of time so you can make sure that you can actually collect your data in the same form so that they are comparable. An explanatory type inquiry, it helps you to try and explain what is going on. This is quite an in-depth and high-level inquiry. And again, you need to make sure that your data is reliable, or you might be explaining relationships, looking at correlations that don't exist, but they are only available because of the data you've collected it. So reliable data is key to an explanation. Explorative investigations are trying to explore what's going on within an area, maybe trying to identify key issues that are affecting situations or locations and purposes of how to understand what's going on. Often it means you don't get to the answer, but you're just exploring what's going on could potentially be the causes. And lastly, we have an experiment. Probably you're more aware of these using them in science, but you could undertake an investigation which is an experiment, but you may have to try and reduce the variables by either doing a model inside a lab or having some control variables within the field. For task 3, again, have a look at those processes or concepts that you were thinking about investigating and just have a consideration of what type of inquiry process would be more suitable. Could you undertake an experiment, or is it more going to be a descriptive inquiry? Have a look, and some of them might make it easier for you to decide which one of those you are going to try and follow. When you're considering your inquiry title, you need to make sure that you could divide it into sub-questions. So if your title is too specific and only relating to one variable that you might be measuring, then that's not going to allow you to have sub-questions. However, if your question is too broad and requires several sub-questions, like 4 or 5, then it might be that it's actually too big. So aim for 3 sub-questions, something that you can divide into 3. Put those 3 pieces of information together will answer that key question is probably ideal. You also need to make sure that it relates to your specification. Now, as you are doing sand dunes in your specification, that should mean that it will relate to it, but think about the other variables that you're going to measure. Are people's perceptions of a place? That's also in your specification, such as how they feel about a location, how they relate to it, but also their impact on it, tourism, erosion, coastal features, coastal processes. All of those can easily be linked to the specification. The next important factor is the manageability of your data collecting. Now, of course, you want to collect as much data as possible, but you do not want to be overwhelmed with too much data, and it all needs to be relevant to your question, your inquiry questions or your sub-questions. So if you think about the location, if you're investigating the impact of physical features on a sand dune system, then you need to make sure that you're away from any human influences. And that means you need to go quite a long way from the car park. So you need to consider walking from the car park and put that into your time scale. Doing a site visit before your data collection or a pilot study is a good idea so you can work out which is the best location. You can also test out your data collection techniques and see whether they're working in the location you've chosen, and also time them to see how long it takes you to do one location. This will make sure you use the time most effectively when you're there for your data collecting. Also, when you get to the location, you need to consider, where are you going to start? What is a reliable and reflective location for the features you want to survey? But you also need to make sure you're not being biased in choosing the perfect place that will answer your question the way you wish it to be answered. Make sure that your location is going to be suitable in terms of answering your question, providing you with reliable data, and also allowing you to undertake the investigation in the time you've got available. Also, if you're thinking of undertaking a transect all the way from the Strand line to the back of the dunes, think about how long that's going to take you just to walk it. And then how many locations do you need to actually sample at? What's your sampling strategy? How many samples are you going to take? Are you going to try and cover each cirral stage? Are you going to be looking at slope angle? Do you need to measure the slope angle? Does that actually help you answer one of your inquiry questions? If you're undertaking data collection which doesn't add to the data required to analyse to answer the inquiry questions, then you don't need to do it. If you have the time to do multiple transects, this will make your results much more reliable. Remember, you can do group data collecting, and some data collecting cannot be done on your own. Just make sure that your location is representative, and repeats make things more reliable. Also, when considering the manageability of it, think about the impact assessment. The impact on you, so in terms of your risk assessment, what risks are you putting yourself in? Is it worth it? And is it safe for you to continue to use that location or to undertake that investigation? And also your impact on the environment. So the ethical considerations. So are you going into a part of the reserve that's going to be very vulnerable to erosion, and therefore you walking on it is going to cause damage? We need to make sure that when we visit these locations to undertake our inquiries, we do not leave negative impacts. So we try and limit or mitigate against those by trying to stick to the paths and trying to avoid the most vulnerable areas to do our investigation. So for the next task, think about the actual hours that you've got on site. So how long will you actually be on site? Try and demarcate some times to have lunch and maybe a couple of breaks. How much time will you actually have for data collection? How long is it going to take you to get to the starting point for your data collecting? And then how many sites are you expecting to sample? Divide that by the amount of time you've got, and you can work out how long you've got at each sample site. If you've got 5 minutes at each sample site, that is not going to be enough to measure anything apart from maybe one variable. If you're planning to measure 4 or 5 things at each sample point, you need to give yourself maybe up to 20 minutes at each sample site to take those readings. If you haven't got enough time, you need to either consider reducing the sample size, so reducing how many times you're taking your data, and try and make sure your gaps in between your locations are not too great. Maybe reduce the area that you're covering, or look at your sub-questions. Do you have too many? Could you just remove one of those, and that will reduce your workload in terms of data collecting at each of your sample sites? It's very useful to make sure that you include some task words or some command words within that inquiry question. It will help you to focus in. It also will help you with your analysis. So for example, if you're using words like to what extent instead of can or does, then you'll know exactly what you're aiming for. You can also look at some language which relates directly to some statistics that you could undertake, such as correlation or relationship. And then again, you know you need to link up some of those variables that you've been measuring, and you need to make sure you measure those variables at the same location. So using some of those high-level command words will mean once you've got your data, you will know how to analyse it, because those data are going to be either compared to each other or they're going to be looking for a relationship between those sets of data. Next task is to see if you can come up with some kind of task word or some word that you think would relate to some of those questions that you've thought about. So if you think about what you've highlighted, those concepts or processes, is there any of those command words that spring to mind? Could you be looking for a correlation or a relationship? Or are you looking for how effective something is or the perception of something? All these words within your inquiry question or your sub-question will really focus you in and get you talking about the data and collecting the correct data to answer the question that you've posed. The last thing you need to consider is to make sure that you can undertake all 6 of those inquiry stages. If you can't undertake any data analysis or data presentation of the results that you're going to collect, then you won't be able to get those points. Think about the inquiry process as a whole, not just as the question, and then go out to take the data. If you've already considered where you're going with this information, how you might present it, not in any great detail, but is it feasible to do a scatter graph with the type of data that you're collecting? If you're taking qualitative data, how are you going to present that? Are you going to turn it into quantitative data so that you can graph it? Or are you going to find some other way of managing it? If you're going to present your data spatially, so in terms of locational data, then you might want to make sure the location, the specific location, is also undertaken when you survey your data. The best way to do that is to undertake a survey using some kind of digital device, like Survey 123 is a great app that you can use, or looking on your device when you're actually taking your data collection, look for a specific longitude and latitude on your phone so you know exactly where you are. If you're trying to present data spatially and all you've got written down is that you were 5 meters from the front of the dunes or you're halfway up the yellow dunes, spatially that's not going to be representative because that's not a set distance. Even though you might be measuring distance from the beach, of course, you've got to take into account the angle, how accurate that tape measure was. If you're using a GPS location, you know that you are exactly right within probably 2 or 3 meters of that location, so you can pinpoint where you are, and then your data will be much more reliable. My next task for you then is to get hold of ArcGIS login for your school, if it's possible, and then you can download the app Survey 123. Create your own little survey and just undertake some data collection in your local area, either in your school grounds, you could even do it in your garden, or just go for a walk outside your house. Have a go, see how it works, then upload it onto ArcGIS and see how the locational data is looking. It will give you ideas, hopefully, as to how you could create your own questionnaire inside the Survey 123 app. Now, the Survey 123 app is not just used for questionnaires in terms of human geography. You use the same questionnaire format for collecting your physical data as well. You just make sure the answer is in number term. So you can use that for collecting any data you like. Really good resource for you to actually make sure you're thinking about the data analysis while you're coming up with your data methods. The last task for you to do is to come up with a draft inquiry question and maybe some sub-questions. Don't forget to look at all the things that you've just done in the previous tasks and use that information to come up with your inquiry question. So make sure that it explores a geographical concept or a context, some processes or a policy. It includes a specific location, obviously Oxwich, but whereabouts exactly in Oxwich. It conforms to one of the inquiry types and trying to identify which type of inquiry you intend to do. It leads to the generation of some sub-questions. If it can't, think about how you can manipulate it, make it broader or narrow it down. It links to the geographical specification, so try and identify which part of the spec it relates to. It's manageable, think about timing, sampling technique, how much data you're going to collect, and where you're going to do it, how long it's going to take you to get there. It allows you to access all parts of the inquiry process, all 6 of them. So think about your data methods, your data presentation, your data analysis, and whether it's feasible to actually answer those questions in the timescale that you've got safely. And then last of all, whether it's got some command words which will help you to identify the type of data analysis you're going to undertake and the data presentation. Once you've got that draft question, come out into the field, we'll have a look round, I'll show you some data methods, some ways in which you can collect your data. You can then come back and completely change your question. That's absolutely fine. Remember, the question is to help you to actually undertake the inquiry question. You shouldn't feel constrained by it, so you can't undertake an even better investigation. It's always something you can adapt, modify, make sure it's meaningful, and you can answer that question in the time and the skills that you've got. I look forward to seeing you on Oxwich.